you as a snare.
Most of you are familiar with something like this. Maybe you've used one. I won't set it. I've been the recipient of it a few times. But the point is, usually the intended victim is lured into the trap. The trap shuts. They're caught. But something else about it is that they're left immobile for a period of time. And when we think about that in God's judgment day and we talk about a snare, we need to appreciate it. It's not just being caught, but being snared in this system of things could cause us to become immobile as far as recognizing what we need to do and make proper decisions as far as serving God is concerned. You know, you might liken it to the fact that possibly in our course of activity, maybe you go shopping one particular day, you're walking out here at the mall and there's a window, and as you're walking, maybe your mind is on something else, but something in that window catches your eye. What do you do usually? Well, sometimes people will stop right where they're at, they backtrack a little bit, and they go back and they look at what's in the window. And if you look long enough, eventually maybe you'll go in and you'll do some shopping inside the store. But the point is, that has caught your attention. You're, so to speak, ensnared, trapped. And isn't it true that you stand there for a few minutes looking and thinking, well, do I need it, don't I need it, should I get it, shouldn't I get it? And then maybe you go in. And the thing is, it immobilizes us for a period of time. So the system of things, whether or not we realize it, can do the same thing to us. In other words, things can be going on around us and we think we're doing pretty good. And yet we might be immobilized, just see inactive as far as our activity is concerned. And that's why it is through the pages of the Bible, the Creator has given us some information that can be a benefit to us, and see how it is that in the past He's reacted to certain situations that can motivate us even now in the present. If you'd like to take your Bibles, please, and turn to the book of Genesis, the 6th chapter. It starts reading there in verse 1. It says, "Now it came about that when men started to grow in numbers on the surface of the ground, and daughters were born to them, then the sons of the true God began to notice the daughters of men, that they were good looking. And they went taking wives for themselves, namely all whom they chose. After that Jehovah said, My spirit shall not act toward man indefinitely, and that he is also flesh. Accordingly his days shall amount to 120 years. Then it says, The Nephilim proved to be in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of the true God continued to have relations with the daughters of men, and they bore sons to them. And they were the mighty ones who were of old, the men of fame. Consequently, Jehovah saw that the badness of man was abundant in the earth, and every inclination of the thoughts of his heart was only bad all the time. Jehovah felt regrets that he had made men in the earth, and he felt hurt at his heart." But now notice this in verse 9. It talks about a man. It says Noah. This is the history of him. Noah was a righteous man. He proved himself faultless among his contemporaries. Noah walked with the true God. So now what we need to ask is, how does this help us in understanding what's going to take place when God's judgment day comes, even now, as to what happened with regard to the time of Noah? And when we consider some of the points here, we're going to appreciate that there really was a pattern as to what took place. What happened in Noah's day foreshadowed many of the things that would take place in the time in which we're living today. If you'd like to leave a marker here in Genesis, the 6th chapter, and just to help you appreciate the point that we're trying to make, in Luke, the 21st chapter, Jesus was asked some questions, one in particular, but he made this comment about a period of time and likened it to the time of Noah in verses 34 and 35. It says, "But pay attention to yourselves that your hearts never become weighed down with overeating, heavy drinking, and anxieties of life. And suddenly that day be instantly upon you as a snare. For it will come in upon all those dwelling upon the face of all the earth." And then in verse 36 it says, "Keep awake." But you notice there it mentions not to become weighed down with many of the things that go on around us. And it says, suddenly that day would be instantly upon us as a snare. And so it was with regard to the time of Noah and what took place in his day. Now, when we talk about Judgment Day, we appreciate that the Bible, as it defines the term Judgment Day, refers to the period of time when God is going to execute judgment on the wicked and bring them to a complete end. So if that's the case, like Luke said there and Jesus said, then we need to be awake. We don't want to be asleep as to what's going on around us. And we can benefit greatly from the information as recorded there in the Bible in Genesis 6 with regard to the time of Noah and what took place. Now, in Noah's day, despite many of the warnings that were given, you notice there were three groups of people that were going to be affected by what took place. There were those angelic sons that materialized. There were the humans living at that time, and there were the Nephilim. The Bible indicates that none of them listened to what Noah had to say, despite everything that took place. Now, one point that we need to make clear, in Genesis 6:5, it says there that Jehovah saw that the badness of man was abundant in the earth, and every inclination of the thoughts of his heart was only bad all the time. Some read this and draw the conclusion then that everyone living at that time was wicked. In other words, they were bad. There were none that were righteously disposed or did anything that were good, so to speak. Of course, we know Noah and his family were righteously disposed, but as far as everyone being bad, wicked, that's not the case. Now, the Bible indicates, if you remember in Luke, that one of the problems was they didn't take note of what was taking place around them. So if that's the case, then the inclination or the indication would be then that they centered their lives, instead of centering their lives around God and what He had warned about, they centered their lives around personal pursuits. Eating, drinking, marrying. See, there's nothing wrong with that, but they centered everything that they did around those particular areas. So they didn't take note, and because they didn't take note, Jehovah brought that final judgment upon them. Interesting to note with regard to the man Noah, it says that he was righteous. He walked faithful as far as those around him were concerned, and it says he walked with the true God. To be faithful or blameless or upright, as the Bible says, in verse 9 there, as one Bible translation says, means to be faultless, that there's nothing in the outward activity or the internal disposition that is odious to God. In other words, or that would bring God's wrath against the individual. So Noah just wasn't the type of person that looked good on the outside. You know, sometimes maybe we think, well, an individual that comes to the meeting, they go out in service, they do various things, they might look good on the outside. But the Bible indicates that there was more to being upright. It says also the internal disposition. So God wasn't just concerned about Noah and looking at his outside appearance. He was concerned about what was inside of him and what was taking place at that time. So Noah was faultless, and yet he was balanced in what he had to do. Now, do we appreciate that Noah just didn't build the ark? Noah had family duties to carry out, and he also had a preaching activity to carry out. Hebrews, the 11th chapter, and verse 7 brings that all to our attention. It shows the relationship of all of that, and yet Noah was balanced in what he did. And remember what Genesis 6:22 says? After God gave the assignment, told Noah how to carry out the work that he was going to do, it tells us how he felt about his assignment. It says there, Noah did just so. He carried it out as he was supposed to carry it out. And as head of the house at that particular time, Noah also had to be concerned about the family, his sons, his wife, and also the wives of his sons. So it wasn't a matter of just saying, well, Noah's sons did it because the father told him he had to do it. They had a choice to make too. Would they listen and obey, or would they go along with what was going on at that time? And something else about Noah, sometimes it is, there's a word that's used, procrastination. Have you ever noticed that? That sometimes somebody says, or we know we have to do certain things, and what do we say when we're going to do it? Well, if I don't get it done today, I'll get it done tomorrow. Tomorrow comes, and when do we get it done? Well, if I don't get it done tomorrow, I've got the next day. And sometimes things sit for years. They never get done. So Noah wasn't like that. He didn't say, well, I'll get to it tomorrow. The Bible indicates he went ahead and did the work that he was supposed to do. And as it indicated, Noah was a preacher of righteousness. He warned those individuals. And his work was not easy when it came to the preaching activity. Imagine yourself dealing with angels who had forsaken their original position in the heavens. And now Noah warns them of this destruction, and also these Nephilim who were bent on violence, and in trying to instruct them and help them to appreciate the need to listen to divine warning. So Noah had a hard assignment, and yet he was willing to carry it out. You see, Noah didn't lose sight of where he was. He didn't let the things around him ensnare him so that he didn't take a proper course. But now the question comes up, why does God need to bring a judgment day at this time? Why does that need to happen? The psalmist explains that for us in Psalm 103 and 19. Here it says, Jehovah himself has firmly established his throne in the very heavens, and over everything his own kingship has held domination. Now picture this if you would. You're the owner of a large company. And within that company you have many employees working for you, and you now find out that they're stealing from you, they're lying. The company is going to go bankrupt if you don't do something about it. Now, if you're the owner, you're just going to say, well, let them do what they want, and it'll correct itself. They'll see that you need to correct, or would you get rid of them? And to possibly try to salvage what you have in order to keep the business going. Well, as the Bible indicates here, Jehovah is the sovereign of the universe. His intention or his purpose with regard to the earth is for man to live at peace and enjoy life to the full, and he has righteous standards, as the Bible indicates. So do you think that he's going to allow wickedness or those that are bent on doing bad to continue forever? And the Bible indicates that he's not. And like Noah's day, we can appreciate that the earth literally today is filled with violence. Some statistics that were given, the USA Today paper carried an article with regard to what people view as violent TV. How many people are willing to turn it off now at this time? In 1982, when they took the survey, 29% of people said that they turned off what they considered bad taste in violence and crime and what they were seeing. Now, in 1988, when the survey was taken, only 21% of these same people see the need to switch the channel. They don't believe that it's bad anymore or it's in bad taste. And when it comes to violent crimes, in 1980, on an average, there was a violent crime every 2.4 seconds. In 1982, there was one violent crime every 24 seconds. A murder every 23 minutes, a rape every 9 minutes, a robbery every 58 seconds. And out of all of these crimes, when we stop to think about it, only 19% of them were solved, as far as finding the one that was guilty with committing the crime. And you see, the Bible indicated that would happen. In fact, the Bible indicated, too, that man, because of being bent on violence or concerned about the violence around them, would even worry about stockpiling weapons. And in 1985, they did a survey of all the nuclear weapons that they have in storage right now, and they made mention of the fact that they have enough nuclear weapons in stockpile to kill 58 billion people. Or that's enough to kill everybody 12 times over. So man is concerned about the violence. When we look sometimes locally in what takes place, how it is that man feels about fellow man, willing to take their life, they're not concerned about it, we can appreciate that we live in very critical times. Used to be you could get on an airplane and you could enjoy a flight somewhere. You don't do that too much if you're going to fly overseas anymore. Some airports have become armed camps. You literally go through guards, the barbed wire, the whole thing, in order to just go and visit other people or maybe see family in other countries. So we see how it is that things have deteriorated, and yet the Bible indicates that God is a God of righteousness, and we can appreciate why he's not going to tolerate this wickedness indefinitely. In the book of Proverbs, the 2nd chapter, verses 21 and 22, it says, "The upright are the ones that will reside in the earth, and the blameless are the ones that will be left over in it." But then it says in verse 22, "As regards the wicked, they'll be cut off from the very earth, and as for the treacherous, they'll be torn away from it." And it follows the pattern as even with regard to the book of Revelation, the 11th chapter. If you remember in verse 18 what it says, God is going to bring to ruin those ruining the earth. And man literally thinks that he is the ruler of the earth, the universe. Tries to control the things that are going on, and he thinks he holds in his hand the balance as to what's going to take place. And that's why in the book of Ezekiel, the Bible writer here, through inspiration, makes this comment in Ezekiel, the 38th chapter, and verse 23. Here the Bible writer says, "And I shall certainly magnify myself, sanctify myself before the eyes of many nations, and they will have to know that I am Jehovah." So very shortly the nations are going to come to the realization of the fact that Jehovah is the universal sovereign, and he's going to make himself known. In the process of all of that, the Bible indicates that God is going to have to rid the earth of all those that oppose him. In the book of Peter, 2 Peter, the 3rd chapter, verses 7 and 10, indicates that not just those that are wicked, but everything associated with a system that is bent on that design. And it talks about the elements and the various conditions in the earth being exposed, some being dissolved, as the Bible indicates. So man's work, his spirit, everything that he desires, so to speak, with this system are going to be done away, completely put out of existence. And for all, as the Bible indicates in the book of Isaiah, Jehovah is going to magnify himself as ruler over all the earth. And man will come to recognize that. So it is that we can learn from the example of Noah, and that Jehovah needs to bring this judgment day in view of how the world and man feels about God as the Creator and universal sovereign. The question now that comes up would be, what about, or how is it that God has warned you and I with regard to this period of time, this judgment day, and being able to escape what might take place? Well, in the book of Ecclesiastes, the 3rd chapter, in verse 1, here the Bible writer says, "For everything there is an appointed time, even a time for every affair under the heavens." So God has seen to it that a timetable is to be carried out in what takes place. He doesn't leave those that serve him without indication of what's going to take place. If you turn back to the book of Amos, the 3rd chapter, in verse 7, notice what the Bible writer here says. It says, "For the sovereign Lord Jehovah will not do a thing unless he has revealed his confidential matter to his servants, the prophets." So here it is that we have Jehovah's assurance that what will take place will not happen without our knowing about it, being given a warning as to what's going to take place. And he's done that. When you think about the various means that he's done it through, there are 4 of them. One of them that we'd like to talk about first is with regard to the sign that Jesus gave in the book of Matthew, the 24th chapter, Luke 21, and Mark chapter 13. But if you turn back to the book of Matthew, the 24th chapter, Jesus was asked in verse 3 of that chapter, "Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your presence and of the conclusion of the system of things?" And now Jesus goes on to enumerate some of the things that would take place when we read through this. He mentions there in verse 6, you're going to hear of wars, reports of wars. In verse 7 he says, "Nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There will be food shortages, earthquakes in one place after another." And he says, all these are the beginning of the pangs of distress. And when we stop and think about where we are in the stream of time as far as man's existence and what's taken place, there are some interesting statistics with regard to what's happened, how far man's warfare has gone. And 1914 was a marked year, as many historians have said, but when it came to death and World War I and the cost and the expense, 14 million individuals lost their lives, both soldiers and civilians, during World War I, at a cost of $337 billion. World War II came, 55 million people, soldiers and civilians, lost their lives. 50 nations were involved, and it cost $1,150 billion to fight that war. That was in war implements. We're not talking about all the other costs that came along with it. And of course, during that period of time, the Bible indicates with regard to, as it says here, food shortages, pestilence, and many other things that would take place. And when we look at the world around us today, we can see just that. Earthquakes, the toll in lives that they've taken in the last few years. With regard to food shortage, and many times we think of just third world countries with regard to having food shortages, but they mention that yearly 12 million children die due to not having enough food to eat. And not just in third world countries. We're talking about right even here in the United States, children dying because of not having enough to eat. There are older individuals, because of being on fixed incomes, that don't have enough to eat, and they're undernourished, as is indicated, as many surveys show. Pestilence, when we think of the various diseases that affected mankind, cancer, now AIDS, see many diseases afflicting mankind because of their immoral way of life and what's taking place. All of these are taking their toll as far as mankind's existence is concerned. So we can appreciate then what Jesus said in the Bible there in the book of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that we're seeing fulfillment in that respect. And it doesn't just stop here. Even when it comes to attitudes of people, in the book of 2 Timothy, and this would be our second point with regard to how Jehovah has warned us or given us direction, 2 Timothy, the 3rd chapter. Here it says, "But know this, that in the last days critical times hard to deal with will be here. Men will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, haughty, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, disloyal, having no natural affection, not open to any agreement, slanderers, without self-control, fierce, without love of goodness, betrayers, headstrong, puffed up with pride, lovers of pleasures rather than lovers of God." And he says, "having a form of godly devotion, but proving false to its power, and from these turn away." When we read this today, we can see that it follows pattern as to people's attitudes. And when we think about that, just to read some of the things that affect people, when it comes to attitudes about, as it says here, no natural affection, there was an interesting point made by a psychologist, a child psychologist. He said, child psychologist Lee Salk made this comment, that the country's devil-may-care, daycare attitude is not the best. He's disturbed about it. He says, "I think there's nothing comparable to being a parent when it comes to responsibility and commitment. And I encourage more and more people to consider not having children." And now notice why. He says it's a tragedy to bring children into this world and then have to find people to take care of them. For us to go out and get more daycare is to make things worse. What we're saying is, I don't have time to love my child, so let's find someone else to love him or her for me. We pay plumbers and electricians a lot more than we pay the people who take care of our children. He says, "I'm not trying to establish a social hierarchies, but it tells me children are low on the totem pole." And that's true. Sometimes when it comes to various activities, when it comes to caring for children, as he mentioned there, individuals will pay much more to have various services done in and around the home, but when it comes to the care of their children, you see, they don't even pay minimum wage to have them cared for. So it's interesting to note the attitude of parents when it comes to children in some instances. No natural affection. Who would have thought that parents would think that the best way to discipline a child and to get their attention is to put them in a frying pan and burn them? Child abuse. Parent abuse. All of the various things that we see going on today. Individuals can die, as it has been mentioned, and people don't even know they're dead. They say sometimes, "Well, I smelled the odor 3 months later coming out of the apartment." One individual laid in his apartment for 1 year before individuals realized there was something wrong. He wasn't coming and going, and other things were taking place. So it makes one wonder in that respect, then, in view of what's said here, what about us? What is our attitude? See, if we adopted the world's attitude about being unthankful, disloyal, having no natural affection, you see, the Bible warned against this and attitudes that could develop among us. Then, too, one of the scriptures we're using in the book of 1 Timothy, the 5th chapter, this would be point number 3, has to do with man's attempts at bringing peace and security. And man is very desperate at this time in order to accomplish that. Nations who used to be enemies of one another now have become friends. They're signing agreements. Nations that were always closed to other nations have now opened up their borders, and they're allowing other individuals to come in. They want to expand. And one newspaper article in Newsweek mentioned the fact that with all that's taking place in many of the communist countries and these nations getting together, they may comment on the fact that the only reason they're doing it, as the article said, is because they're afraid. They're afraid that they're literally going to destroy themselves, so the article said they think they need to do something in order to prevent that. So at any cost, they said they'd do it. So man, as it indicates, would try to bring peace, but you notice there in verse 3 what it says? It tells us not to be fooled by this, because it says God's day is coming as a thief, and when they start doing all of this, it says sudden destruction is to be instantly upon them. So it indicates man will think they've accomplished something. And the point is, we don't want to be fooled by it either. See, ensnared by it, thinking that, well, now, here they're doing this, they're doing that, and maybe it's not going to be that close as we think, and so we get ensnared by what's taking place. And then the last point has to do with Jesus' words in the book of Matthew. He talked about a generation that saw these things begin would see them end. Sometimes it is, as the Watchtower brought out on the May 15th, 1984, some individuals try to categorize a generation with years. Some interpret a generation to mean a period of 30, 40, 70, or even 120 years. Interesting to note that Jesus didn't mean that. It says a generation is really related to people and events rather than to a fixed number of years. So as it says, the sum total of those born at the same time expanded to include all those living at the given time, generation, or contemporaries. And so it would be in the sense as some talk about, well, in my father's day. So it would be those living at that time, those born at that time that would make up that generation. And when we look at things today, there are still those from 1914 forward that are still living. And the Bible indicates that they would not all die before that period of time that change would take place. But do we understand all of that, or are we the type of individual like some around us that to put a date to everything, counting years in what takes place? There are quite a number of things that are affecting mankind when it comes to attitudes and various things. Jesus' prophecy, when it comes to food that we eat, there's quite an article in the one magazine that dealt with the dangers in the vegetable patch. Even the food we eat is polluted with pesticides. Something else, when it comes to the form of worship that's pleasing to God, there was an article in December 1st, 1988, newspaper clipping that talked about the parents' need to meet the challenge of Satanism. Remember we talked about how it was that they would have a form of godly devotion? And some individuals feel that worshiping Satan is part of that form of godly devotion. See, they've been sidetracked in their belief and their interest in God. So the question is, have we been affected by any of these areas? Have we gone to sleep when it comes to recognizing what's happening around us and what the Bible indicated what would take place? And what is our attitude? See, 1 Timothy, the 3rd chapter, helps us to analyze that. Have we allowed the thinking of this world, their attitudes, their viewpoints towards one another to affect our thinking? If that's the case, we're striving to not be ensnared by this system, then the question would come up, what do we need to do in order to avoid not being ensnared? One of the first things that we could discuss is the need to flee from Satan's organization. One part of that organization is mentioned in the book of Revelation, Revelation the 18th chapter. Here in the 18th chapter in verse 4, it makes this comment. It says, I heard another loud voice out of heaven say, Get out of her, my people, if you do not want to share with her in her sins, and if you do not want to receive part of her plagues. And if you go back to verse 2, it talks about Babylon the Great. This is the one we need to get out of. The Bible indicates this is the world empire of false religion. So the question is, what about us? Are we avoiding those things that could put us in a position when it comes to false worship out of harmony with God, or do we see the need to be separate when it comes to worship of God? In other words, do we sympathize with false religion with regard to her religious holidays, possibly maybe at work, school, or with relatives? Do we compromise our position when it comes to being separate in these areas? Then, if you remember in John the 18th chapter, in verse 36, Jesus was asked if his kingdom was part of this arrangement. He said his kingdom was no part of this world. So God's people then cannot have God's favor and still be friends of the world. James 4:4 brings that out. If we think we can, we're only making ourselves an enemy of God. So we need to be careful in these areas. And when it comes to God's viewpoint with regard to life and morals, how do we view them? Are we the type of individual like the world, well, live for the day, enjoy yourself, do what you want, and then later on, if there's any consequences, well, we take the consequences. Say, oh, well, I didn't know. Those who are acquainted with God's Word know what His moral standards are. And if you remember in 1 John 2:15 through 17, the Bible very strongly indicates where it is that an individual would stand in this area, and it indicates what the flesh could desire. It says there, do not be loving either the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. Because everything in the world, the desire of the flesh, the desire of the eyes, the showy display of one's means of life does not originate with the Father. But notice it says originates with the world. And then it goes on to say the world is passing away and so is its desire. But he that does the will of God remains forever. So the Bible's direction is very clear-cut when it comes to worshiping and doing what's pleasing before God. So do we see the need to do that? When it comes to getting out of Satan's organization and not being ensnared by it, are we doing that? Or do we let down our guard and allow these other things to creep in and then let them affect our viewpoints in what we do? If we're going to avoid Satan's system, then there are a number of things that we need to do. One of them is to earnestly take a stand for God's kingdom. In order to do that, in Isaiah, the 2nd chapter, verses 2 through 4, it talks about coming up to the mountain of the house of Jehovah. And there it talks about the attitude of people that would come up there. They'd literally take what was violent instruments of warfare and even personalities and change them into peaceful ones. So have we done that? Have we molded our personalities in the right way? Now, in order to mold our personalities, one of the first things that we need is what's mentioned at Hebrews 10, 24, and 25. Regular association with God's people. So do we do that? Are we regular in our attendance here at the meetings? And then the next point was to keep busy in the preaching work, kingdom preaching work. Remember what we said about Noah? Noah had to rely on God for courage to preach. Think about that. As we said, he had angelic creatures who materialized. They knew they did wrong. And now he goes and tells them, you're going to be destroyed, or you're going to lose your life, your fleshly life. They dematerialized. It's true. The Nephilim, they were going to lose their lives. They were bent on wickedness. The people around them were bent on just day-to-day living. And he says, well, now you've got to think about this. Change your attitude. They didn't want to listen. Well, Noah, you know it's never rained. How do we know it's going to happen? And you know, sad to say, some of God's people have become like that. Well, you know, they've been saying this for how many years? So the question is, what is our attitude when it comes to the preaching work at this time? And Noah didn't fear man. And he would have had a lot to fear in view of what was going on around him. He didn't give in. He didn't give suit, so to speak, to what was going on around him. And we can appreciate that when we really look at the courage it took for him to go forth and do the work that he had to do at that time. Now, the Bible writer Peter, in the 2nd book of Peter, the 3rd chapter, mentions something else that we have to do if we're going to avoid being ensnared by this system. In the 3rd chapter, starting with verse 11. Here in verse 11 it says, since all these things are thus to be dissolved, what sort of persons ought you to be in holy acts of conduct and deeds of godly devotion? And it says, awaiting and keeping close in mind the presence of the day of Jehovah, through which the heavens being on fire will be dissolved and the elements being intensely hot will melt. And then verse 14 says, hence, beloved ones, since you are awaiting these things, do your utmost to be found finally by him spotless and unblemished and in peace. Now you notice there in verses 11 and 12, it tells us that we need to be concerned about our conduct, our deeds of godly devotion, and it says, while we await and keep close in mind the presence of the day of Jehovah. So we need to ask ourselves, have we done that? Do we appreciate where we are in the stream of time, and do we keep those things close in mind, or have we pushed them off and are pursuing other things? And then in verse 14 it says that we need to be spotless and unblemished. Well, now what's the difference? A spot is a blemish, isn't it? Or is it? You notice Peter used them here, not in the same context. He says spotless and unblemished. Indicated that there would be a difference between the two of them. Now, I'm sure you'll appreciate that a spot, if you've ever gone out to eat and maybe you're eating something, and sometimes we know a person has a spot. Some brothers and sisters can tell just by the brother's tie. They know what they've had for dinner, what they've had for lunch, because see the spot's there. Did you ever notice sometimes if you're somewhere eating that maybe if something splashes up, the person will maybe, if it's a brother, button his coat and maybe that'll hide it. Or maybe you'll see them taking the napkin and here's the glass of water and they dip the napkin in, and what are they doing? They rub the spot. They don't want it to set. Spots can be unsightly, but the point is they go away. We can get rid of them. So with regard to a Christian, they have to maintain fine conduct and have a good attitude, because you see, bad attitude can hinder us in what we do. Now, there are a number of areas that Christians can spot themselves up in. The first one is that mentioned in James, the 3rd chapter, and verse 6. And I think you're all familiar with what it says there. It talks about the tongue. So the question is, how do we use our mouth? Are we the type of individual that's constantly talking about things we shouldn't talk about? Maybe we find something out about a particular brother and sister. Now, are we the type of person that spreads that all around? Or do we see the value of what it says there to keep the tongue under control? Because the tongue can spot us up in what takes place. So the question is, do we gossip? You see, that's what it would amount to. Then also in 1 Peter 4, 1 through 4, it talks about how it was that we don't want to walk as the nations walked. And it talks about there in their immorality and their loose conduct. So the question is, when it comes to Jehovah's laws and His requirements with regard to morals, how do we stand up to them? Remember in Matthew 5:28 what Jesus said, if we look and have a passion within our hearts, we've already committed adultery. So in other words, even the wrong course, reading, looking at. So when it comes to pornographic literature, movies, or TV programs that explicitly are designed for those purposes, are we the type that sit and watch them? Or do we turn them off and not take the time to even do that? And when it comes to others in the congregation, here's another question. 1 Timothy 5, 1 and 2 talks about treating older ones, brothers and sisters, sisters in the congregation, as mothers and daughters with chasteness. So do we avoid flirting with others? And is our conduct with the opposite sex that which would be viewed as chaste at this time in which we're living? Or do we take advantage of situations? And here's another question that's asked. In Jude 23, the latter part of it, it says, hate even the inner garment that has been stained by the flesh. And here's a question that we need to ask ourselves. If an act of immorality is committed in a moment of weakness or carelessness, do we hide it, or do we seek the help from the elders to remove the stain? See, that's what we need to ask ourselves. In any one of these situations, if possibly we're doing things that are out of harmony with God's purposes, do we hide it, cover over, or do we seek the help from the brothers so as to remove the stain? And you see, the Bible indicates there in Jude, like it says in the 23rd, Jude 23 and B, that we should hate the inner garment that's been stained by the flesh. In other words, we've got to clear, so to speak, that with Jehovah and get our conscience and also seek His forgiveness in a right way. And we don't do that by covering over. And then another area with regard to being spotted up by this system is with regard to materialism. Remember what 1 Timothy 6, 9 through 14 talks about? It talks about not having too much money, but it talks about the love of money and how it can affect us and what can take place. And also one other area has to do with elders in the congregation. If there are those who try to disrupt the congregation's organization, that speak out against those that are in positions of oversight and become deceptive in their teaching, do we allow that to take place? Or do we correct the individual? And you see, the principle is found in 2 Peter 2:13. And the need not to allow these individuals to spot up the congregation. And they do. Because you see, those that talk out against Jehovah's arrangement are not working in harmony with keeping themselves clean and unspotted, as the Bible indicates. It indicates that possibly the next point there's something wrong, and that is there's possibly a blemish. And a blemish, if you appreciate, is not just something that's on the outside. A blemish comes from the inside. And that's why Paul uses spots and blemishes. See, spots are on the surface, a blemish is deep within. So the question that's asked there is, what are we like deep inside ourselves? Is our personality true and pure before Jehovah? Or do we by mouth and by action show that we don't desire to live up to what Jehovah says and what we need to do? So we have to make sure that we're serving Jehovah and our brothers in sincerity and not out of selfishness. And sometimes brothers and sisters will feel it's their duty to speak up and say things and be very unkind to others. But as is indicated here, it could show our true heart motivation and what our personality is like and what takes place. So we need to be on guard. So in order to avoid blemishes and spots, as the Bible indicates, then we have to do what Colossians says. Colossians, the 3rd chapter, starting with verse 8. And sometimes as indicated in verse 8 right away, those that have blemishes usually indicate this by personality traits. And notice what some of them are. It says, but now really put them all away from you: wrath, anger, badness, abusive speech, obscene talk out of your mouth. And then verse 9 says, do not be lying to one another, strip off the old personality, clothe yourself with a new personality, which through accurate knowledge is being made new according to the image of the one who created it. And then if you drop down to verses 13 and 14, it says, continue putting up with one another, forgiving one another freely if anyone has a cause for complaint against another. Even as Jehovah freely forgave you, so do you also. But besides all these things, clothe yourselves with love, for it is a perfect bond of union. So you see, that inner quality of serving God should motivate us to want to do what's right. So when it comes to our Christian personality, we need to ask ourselves, what is it like? Has it been spotted by this system of things? And could it be now blemished because of not changing those spots, see, getting rid of them and cleaning them up? See, those are the things we need to ask ourselves. And the reason we do is because the Bible indicates that very shortly God is going to bless or bring blessing upon those that have remained unspotted and unblemished from this system of things. The Bible indicates that in 2 Peter, the 3rd chapter, it talks about a new heavens and a new earth. And in Revelation 21, 3 and 4, it talks about some of the things man will enjoy. And no more sickness, sorrow, death, all the things that affect mankind now at this time. And imagine being able to get up in the morning, and if someone asks how you are, you don't come up with a pat answer, fine, and you don't really mean fine. We'll feel good about how we are and what we're doing, and we'll be satisfied in the work that the Creator's given us to do. And imagine being able to welcome back and teach those that have lost their lives due to imperfection, those that are dead in the grave, and that are brought back to life again. And that's an assured promise, as Jesus indicated in the book of John, the 5th chapter, verses 28 and 29. So we would hope then that God's judgment day will not catch us as a snare. You see, there are many blessings in store for those that desire to live in harmony with what God has purposed and He's outlined in His Word, the Bible. So the question is, with regard to our activity and what we do, we need to ask ourselves that question continually. Will God's judgment day come upon you as a snare?